morning and welcome back to our daily Bible reading. I'm Jesse Nelson.
Edwin Jones.
We are here and we are in the midst of what is considered Jesus' greatest sermon.
And rightfully so, and we are.
Rightfully so, and one of the reasons why, I'll make sure I am not on. All right. I probably sound a little better now because I'm actually on.
Actually on the mic? Wow.
But Jesus is arguably one of his greatest sermons, and I think one of the reasons why is because it's kind of an introduction into kingdom life, though
It is.
we've discussed last time that he is teaching the Torah and what they should have understood, and really what that points to is kingdom life has always been kingdom life.
It is. He's letting them know what they should have understood and done.
Yeah.
That came straight out of the Old Testament.
And those are being directly, as we'll say, injected into every area, even into the new kingdom that is coming.
Yes, because God doesn't change. Kingdom principles don't change.
Yeah.
The window dressing can change, but the essentials don't.
Yep. So we're coming to a close of this sermon. And so far, Jesus has kind of looked at who you are as a person, right? Meekness and
Your
lowliness and
if you will,
attitudes.
and, your
How you feel
influence.
towards other, But it's all, so far, kind of it's been, chapter 5 was internal, how you feel. No one can even see those feelings. It's just how you are
You
internally
and God.
battling.
Let's get this right.
With your enemies, with your brothers, all those kinds of things, all right? And if we were wanting to be like God, be perfect as God isn't perfect, our enemies is a good test. How we treat and think about, pray for, that's a good test, because God, obviously, we were all at one time, as Romans talks about, an enemy towards God.
No, the whole thing, and it's true in Christianity, is how do we become congruent with the mind of God?
Yeah.
Because that will then go into anything that ever happens, and we will be able to know, as we know God, what he would do, and that's what we're supposed to do.
Yep. And so then Matthew 6, Jesus kind of took a turn to things that other people can see. You know, almsgiving, prayer, fasting, things that are normally seen by the Jewish community. There's three public things that, happen. And Jesus is really getting them to understand that, it doesn't need to be public. People will see it, but don't do it to be seen. And then finally transition to this trusting in God. Right? You have a lot of anxieties and cares in this world. They'll be there, but seek first the kingdom.
You'll be all right.
You'll be all right. And so now, chapter 7, it almost seems like it's a jump, but it's still dealing with the same
thing,
how you deal with people, interpersonal relationships. And obviously one of the most quoted or known verses in all of the Bible we're about to read.
Indeed.
So we're going to jump right into Matthew chapter 7. Judge not that you be, let me get fixed here, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you. So let's stop there for a second, because the word judge can mean several different things.
It can.
Even in the Bible, right?
Yes. Context, as we say, determines meaning.
Context determines meaning. So sometimes the word judge is just to make a judgment on something.
Yeah, just a neutral thing. You'd rather have a black thing than a red thing.
Yeah, so it's discernment, taking into consideration all the things. Now sometimes you have a judge making a judgment.
It's official. It has some teeth to it.
Yes, and then there are other times where the Bible talks about God making pronouncement of judgments on someone's eternal.
Which is the really serious stuff.
Which is really serious stuff. And I believe why Jesus brings up pronouncement is the fact that that's probably the context, is these are people who are pronouncing whether you are a follower of God or not.
Yes, which is a little bit above our pay grade.
Yeah, it is. And we're talking, obviously, with brothers, fellow brothers.
Fellow Jews in this situation.
Fellow Jews.
Could be fellow Christians up here.
Fellow Christians. And so you're now taking someone who God has called a member of his family, and you are the determining factor whether they are in or out. And I don't think we should do that.
It should not be done easily. The warning of verse 2 is, hey, you know what? If we don't do that well, it's going to come back on us. That ought to frighten folks.
So let's look at that. For the judgment with which you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it would measure to you. And I think that's something that we need to consider is how harshly do we want God to judge us?
That's a different subject. We can look at that differently, don't we?
Yeah.
We won't slack.
I want as much grace as possible. So what I'm going to extend as much grace as possible, and there's that as possible.
As possible.
Because there are things that God has given us that when judgments need to be made, especially by the church as a whole, where there's leaven in the group or there's something that is, infecting the group and making things, So there are judgments to be made, but we don't want to be making pronouncement of people's fates easily.
We were talking about Pharisees. It gets introduced back in 5:20. We've got to exceed their righteousness. And they were very judgmental. They like to elevate themselves. The classic prayer between the Pharisee and the tax collector. He's passing judgment on himself. I'm a good man, and I'm not like him.
Yeah.
That's what they love to do, and people love to do that.
Yeah. And what we're going to see in verse 3, we'll just read it and then we'll talk about it. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, while there is a log in your own eye? This is a humorous statement.
Semitic humor, exaggeration.
Yeah.
Jesus does this, like a camel going through the eye of a needle and things like that. It gets people's attention.
But when you're imagining this, and they were very much a picturesque people, like that's why a lot
They're
of
an oral culture, not a book culture.
Yeah, so a lot of their things are in images. And so when you're thinking of a plank coming out of your eye and me trying to get a speck out of yours.
Smile comes to your face.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is do we weigh sins? Do we weigh, and we talked about this in our podcast episode. Sometimes we think, well, my sin's not that bad. We always say our sin, we have justifications for ours.
Exactly.
But we never have justifications for
we don't try to
else's.
get the other person's point of view or anything.
Yeah. So Jesus says, you hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye. And, if you consider a log to be sin, one, you got to recognize Jesus is not saying you can take care of sin yourself.
No.
And I think what we're going to see as we get further into this is that it has to do with the asking God, the golden rule. God is giving you the gift of salvation because you have asked for this plank to be removed. You have asked for salvation, right? You have gone to God. You trust in God on salvation. And once you can do that and your relationship with God is squared up, then you can adequately start looking at other people's lives and you can tell, hey, their life what you desire is not to judge them, not to pronounce judgment, but you want to help them.
Help them get to heaven.
Yeah, and that's
because God wants us to go to heaven.
Yeah.
But we put barriers there because of our selfishness and our flesh that take us completely out of how God looks at things.
Absolutely. So he goes, and this verse 6 is kind of the dichotomy. This is kind of the opposite. Do not give dogs what is holy. Judgment.
That's a judgment, yeah.
You have to make a judgment to figure out who are dogs and who are not, but you don't make those easy.
No.
You don't make those judgments easy. And that's why one of the things we talk about, as we're going to get later, is their fruits will expose them.
Yes.
Continual
fruit inspectors, as they say.
Yeah, continual actions. One-time actions does not determine someone's tree.
No, and I've heard, I probably even said, you may have said it as well, that we can't see people's motives. Well, fruit can be traced back to motives.
Fruit can be. And fruit is one of those things that it's continually producing these same effects, these same actions, these same... All right, so do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. So, how does this fit in context of judging one another, helping each other as a brother, taking specks out of people's eyes? There are times where I think where people become projects for us, and you can spend so much time trying to help somebody, but you've got to come to a point, kind of like the shaking the dust off your feet.
Yeah, shaking the dust off your feet.
Where this person, if they don't want to be helped, they're not going to be helped.
All through Jesus' ministry, he gets large crowds.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, the crowds are being dispersed to smaller numbers because they decide that they don't want the pearl. They don't see it as a pearl. They don't see it as valuable stuff. And they don't want to have anything to do with it. Sometimes they get snarky with Jesus. Eventually, they crucify him. So there comes a point where we move on.
Yeah. Well, I think the ending of this verse, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you.
Or
so
crucify you, perhaps.
The context before this is basically forgiving others, not judging others. But we got to be careful because if we allow people to continually, there are people who will find out about our nature, that we are forgiving, we are merciful. They'll take advantage of that.
They will. I post on Facebook a fair bit. I got attacked royally the other day by somebody, a post I put on there about baptism.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because what they said was, that I had scripturally proved my point. They just didn't like my point. And I'm like, how ironic is that? You have acknowledged that I gave you scripture, but you don't like where it went, so you don't like me.
Yep. And that's, people will do what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, verse 7. And I don't believe this is just a lot of people separate the first 6 verses. They stop, Jesus made a point, new point.
No, I think it's all interrelates.
I think all the way down, even at the golden rule, and even further.
Yes, even beyond.
These are all. So ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. And in the context of judgment and taking out the speck of plank of your own eye, I think the context of asking God, seeking, and that's why he says, those who knock and seek, it will be open. We're looking for the way of justification, righteousness that is greater than the Pharisees, salvation, but also our daily stuff, as in the prayer, give us our daily bread, our next day's bread. All these things are coming together, and going back to the anxieties as well, right? Going back to not putting your trust in manna, not putting your trust in money, and things that rust and moth and rust destroy. God provides all these things for us. Be an
asker and a seeker. Then you'll be a finder.
And I think once we realize how much God does for us, and those blessings are supposed to extend beyond us, and we are to bring them to our brothers and sisters in Christ, right? Galatians 6
exactly
says what? That you are to do good.
To all men, especially to the household of faith. Yeah. And if we see somebody that is having a spiritual problem, we're supposed to intervene gently, mercifully, to try to get it to a good resolution.
Yeah, we do not become spiritual watchdogs, the police officers of God's kingdom. We are more like shepherds, all of us.
Yes. Our desire ought to be for anybody in our sphere, how can I help them be with God and be with God forever?
So ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds. The one who knocks, it will be open. Now, I get concerned about this verse because I don't necessarily see what other people see in it, in the sense of a lot of people see, well, God, basically, if they're going to be saved, they will be saved.
And this is really talking about a saved people context.
Yes, it's not. Yeah, this is talking about a people who already are in a relationship with God, who are continuing to rely upon God for their justification, sanctification, salvation, but also their daily needs in the kingdom, in this kingdom life.
There are some broad applications, I think, out here, but this is practical, everyday stuff for believers.
Yeah, and ultimately it does, if there is a non-believer who is seeking and knocking and they are going all the way, I believe that context will fall into this category, but I'm just not comfortable with saying it's almost kind of the primitive Baptists, who believe that, well, God already knows everyone who's going to be saved. Everyone who will be saved will be saved. Yeah. So we don't even need to talk to people about Jesus, because if they're going to be saved, they're going to be saved.
There are some who speculate, and I kind of agree with them, that those doctrines that have absolute sovereignty, that God has already chosen who's going to be saved and who's not, are to deal with the fact of what about these people that haven't heard? Yeah. And that's a convenient way of saying, it's going to be all right. Well, there's some murkiness out there in that consideration, but we're supposed to deal with what He's given us to deal with. Yeah. There are bigger fish to fry, and God's going to fry them.
And depending on how you define absolute sovereignty, right? I mean, I obviously...
we believe that.
We believe that God is sovereign, but the fact, part of His sovereignty is giving people the choice.
Doesn't He have the choice to give a choice?
Yeah, and so it's like your kids, when you send them outside, they couldn't go outside unless you determine that they go outside. They're not breaking your law, but once they're outside, they kind of have this, you have the principles you've given them, laws, but they now have the choice to either align with those or not align with those.
Yes.
Or as a parent, you could choose to follow them around, make sure they never do anything wrong, I think God doesn't do that. He's wanting us to grow and mature.
The foreknowledge and how this all works out, we're talking about God, that's bigger than us, but I believe it works out. His foreknowledge and His predestination work together. They are not at cross purposes with each other.
Yeah, and once again, there are things that God, He may look at what I'm saying and go, you nice little chap,
Bless your heart.
Bless your heart. You don't understand all of it, and I don't.
And we don't.
I don't presume
which is good.
to.
If we did, we'd be God.
Yes, absolutely. So, getting into the immediate context, which one of you, if a son asks him, for bread, we'll give him a stone. Or if he asks for a fish, we'll give him a serpent. If then you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to ask him? And I'm going to read the next verse because I think you were one of the first people that brought this up to me, that the golden rule, so whatever, or therefore, so whatever is the same. You wish that others would do to you, you also do to them, for this is the law and prophets.
That's not a verse in isolation.
No, and that's another way of saying love your neighbor as yourself, by the way. Because when he sums up the law and prophets, it's usually a love your neighbor. Galatians uses that, Galatians 5. James uses that as the royal law. And the context being in judgment, but also in asking and seeking and knocking. So what we want for people is their relationship with God, and that's the golden rule.
Yes, if I want to go to heaven, I don't want you doing for me things that are my selfish desires, because that is hindering me from going to heaven. If I want to go to heaven, what I want you to do for me is to help me to get there. So that should be what I do for you, not just you have a whim and I'm going to gratify it. No, I want to help you get to heaven.
Yeah, because what if my desire is I want you to help me to commit some sin?
Yeah.
Well, this law doesn't give you...
I can't possibly be talking about that. Yeah.
So there's a context to it. There's a context to it. All right, then 13 and 14, and I think here's where we this is the going all the way back to Matthew 5, greater than the righteousness of the Pharisees. There are two roads. There's not a third option.
No.
You're either with Jesus all the way, or you're not.
That's it.
And you're not like, well, I'm real close.
We can't serve two masters.
Can't serve two masters. So when you're reading this, look at all the twos. Two gates, two roads, two different kinds of prophets, two different kinds of disciples, right? So
it's stark.
Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy. That leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. Those who find it are few. And there's the reality of the kingdom.
It is, and I think it ties back to, as you were pointing out, all these things tie together. If you were going to find a place in a city back then, you can get into, let's say, Jerusalem real easily.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to go to Fred, the leather guy's shop, you're going to have to ask. You're going to have to go through those windy, unmarked streets. And then you're going to have to knock when you get to Fred's place to get it. You've got to be proactive. You don't just stumble upon it. And the Broadway is a stumbling upon it way. You don't stumble upon it.
And this, by the way, this is the context of religious people. As we're going to get down later, this is not even talking about the Christian and non-Christian. This is talking about those who are trying to follow Christ, those who are trying to follow in the kingdom. Even in the kingdom, there are people going to think the kingdom is this life, and the Pharisees had that pegged down.
Course of least resistance, what gratifies us, what elevates us, what puts other people down. That's the way to do it.
But true disciples,
they don't go that way.
They're going to follow Jesus all the way.
They're going to help each other. They're going to look for God's answers.
So a lot of times we talk about, the percentage between the world, Christians and non-Christians. This is actually even making that percentage lower because you're getting into religious people.
This is people that sit on pews, so to speak.
Yeah. Or those who trust in their own righteousness, right? Those who are trying to do it their own way, checklist Christianity, whatever. That's what the Pharisees had set up.
And as we're going to see here, we can figure out who those folks are.
Yeah. All right, your turn.
Beware the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. So you mean they don't come up, I am a false prophet, you better be careful. No.
I wish they wore a name tag.
Well, it would be nice, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles are they. So the fruit betrays the tree.
Yeah.
So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. So let's think about that for a minute. Does that mean that a good person never does anything wrong?
No.
Does it mean that a bad person never does anything right?
So fruit, when you follow this out in the rest of Scripture, fruit is a chosen lifestyle.
Yes,
it is not
it's the compilation of things.
It's not singular actions.
No.
It is singular actions that are producing.
Yes.
Everyone can see, Edwin, you are this kind of person.
Yeah, it's obvious. If you don't see it, it's your fault.
It's obvious. It's not that, oh man, I said a bad word on accident. in a fight, whatever it may be.
That may not be your fruit at all.
That's not your fruit. That is a one-time singular action. This is kind of like the 1 John 1, as you walk in the light.
And 3, we don't practice unrighteousness. If we're righteous, we practice righteousness.
Yes. Fruit you're producing in your life.
So every tree that does not bear fruit, and this gets pretty interesting here, is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. He's the one that's going to enter. Because there are going to be many people who come to him on that day. This seems to be like really the big day. And they're going to say, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So bringing that fruit argument that he has introduced into this, we find that those are the people who are saying, Lord, Lord.
Yeah.
Now, it's not wrong to say Lord, Lord, but they're saying it as a cover, as a substitute. They talk a good game, but they don't play a good game.
Well, Paul's going to deal with these false apostles in 2 Corinthians, where they've got this letter of commendations. They've got all the right outward credentials, but inwardly, Paul's saying, look at the differences between our ministry. And it becomes very clear immediately once you start examining what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they're doing it for. Versus
who's in
Paul.
it for what? It's easy.
Yeah.
No, and there again, you have situations where, let's take a contemporary situation. You might have a person who is well thought of, who goes to all the right things and is appreciated by all the right people and places. That of itself means absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
It is an examination, a fair one. Not that we're going around with a plaque looking for specs, but a fair one. What are they really up to? How are they really serving God's purposes?
Yeah, and this goes all the way back to the judgment, pronouncing judgment. Still, we have not pronounced judgment. All we've done is recognized who's the swine, who's the dogs,
They're
and
swine.
People who we will not associate with, or we keep God still determines, because that person can still change.
They can.
That person can still, whatever.
Paul.
Look at all the people who did change when they actually got the truth of the gospel. But our job, we also have to protect ourselves and sheep and churches and congregations in the kingdom from these kinds of people.
Because they're not going to come announcing who they are, and we need to have the right kind of healthy scrutiny.
Yeah.
That's part of what we're supposed to have.
Yeah.
So, these people who come to Jesus and say, we did a lot of stuff, and it even mentions miracles. First of all, there are lying wonders that people do. And look at the situation today. How many people today claim to be working miracles?
Yeah.
And they don't even get along with each other. This person working miracles says those people are false. They'll say those are false. Those are false. They're speaking in tongues. No, they're not speaking in tongues. No, we're speaking. There's all kind of things out there like that, even today, that I don't think are genuine, but nevertheless, I think it illustrates the point here. They're saying, look at what we've done.
Well, look at the church of Corinth. They had more gifts than seemingly everybody, and they were so divided they couldn't even get along. What good is that?
I know.
It's not good for anybody.
Okay. Well, the big old Bible school time. The two foundations. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts upon them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, slammed against that house, and yet it does not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act upon them will be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and slammed against the house, and it fell, and
Great was its fall.
Great was the fall thereof.
So here's my question. I believe 21 through 23 is speaking about Day of Judgment stuff. But Jesus brings it from 24 and the 27, this two foundations, into a more practical, that actually those who are in a right relationship with God, doing Christianity right, trying to serve God, humble, lowly,
Firm foundation.
When things do hit us, when storms of life hit us, we have a rock solid faith in Christ. Our faith is not in ourselves. Our faith is in God. And things don't shake us, but it's when the storms hit and you see those people just, the wheat separated
The
from the chaff.
hirelings, if you will, when the wolf comes.
Right? They're gone. They're immediately gone. And look at those teachers, those prophets, those preachers, those pastors, whatever. When things hit hard, boom, they're out. Because a lot of times, a lot of the persecution comes because of things they've been doing
exactly
behind the
or
scenes.
encouraging. No, but we've been doing the prophets, all the false prophets. There's tons of them, and they're telling people what they want to hear. What happens to those guys when Babylon comes?
Yeah.
Well, they're out of there.
I'm going to do a reversal of what Paul tells Timothy about godliness is not only useful for this life, but the eternal life. Jesus is saying godliness, kingdom life, is not only useful for the day of judgment, but it's useful for you now.
It actually determines the day of judgment.
Because I get so discouraged sometimes when we only think about blessings about heaven, what it will be like. Wait a minute, kingdom life is supposed to give you those blessings here.
That right here.
Right here and right now.
Exactly.
And ultimately into the future. But he's also giving you peace and joy and happiness and purpose.
In the world you'll have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. Those of you who are old, such as myself, may remember Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union. And he, in the UN, took his shoe off and pounded it upon a desk and said, "We will bury you." And most people didn't understand what he meant. He meant that our ideology, our communism, will take over your democracy, and we will win. But that said, we have people that come up and rise up on the scene, and they can disconcert us, and that wind will start blowing. They can't touch us.
No. Even if a nation that we live in falls,
even if
the kingdom still stands.
Right, we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Okay.
This word astonished or amazed is literally like shocked to the core.
What's he doing?
Yeah, I mean, they've never heard something like this before.
Isn't that sad?
Because what they're used to is the regular Pharisaical, scribal, quote Rabbi so-and-so, same arguments that have been going on for years.
We got 7 rabbis here that prove that what we're saying is right.
Well, and I'm going to say something.
Go ahead. Life is short.
Whenever, and I'm not saying that I'm anything like Jesus or you're anything like Jesus, but we're hoping to try to be like him in teaching.
Trying to be like him.
I get amazed that when I go places and I start teaching and people are like, it's not that I've never heard these things, but for years and years and years, I've only heard the same sermons, the same lessons, and it's, the same 7 sermons on this, 7 sermons on that, 7 perfect.
Christ-likeness, being transformed in the image of Jesus, which ought to be the most prevalent thing about a Christian's life, sometimes doesn't even get any attention at all.
No. And I hope that we have not created a new first century Jewish system where we're so caught up into
we're caught up in what
this
all
speaker,
the preachers have said, and
this
so we're
person,
saying the same thing.
This person said it, therefore it's gospel. And Jesus comes along and says, you know what? The gospel is a whole lot more than even truths. You look at the 7 churches of Revelation, Ephesus, they had all the right teachings. They got rid of all the right false teachers. They were the place that you would have called a sound congregation. And yet they lost their love.
They're on the verge of not even being a church anymore.
Yeah.
If they don't get their first love back.
So kingdom life is about everyday stuff.
It is. Yeah, there are things that need to be preached along the way that are common amongst believers. But what about these things that Jesus is teaching? Are those core kingdom things? When he got the opportunities to preach, those are the things he's centered on, because it would filter out into everything. Is that our focus?
Yeah. I mean, there's a balance between, Peter says, I need to constantly remind you of these things, which, funny thing, people always use that to talk about core doctrines. He's actually just talking about add to your faith virtue, knowledge. He's talking about everyday life stuff, so I'm reminding you of everyday life stuff. It's basic stuff. And then you got the Hebrews writer who says, let's move beyond the basic stuff.
Let's get out of that.
The word.
Yeah.
So there's a balance, but
sure.
We got to get to a point where we are having these kind of discussions where we're looking at the principles Jesus has given us and seeing how do these apply, and that's what Jesus has done.
If preaching the essence of the Sermon on the Mount causes those listening to say, wow, I hadn't heard that, then something's wrong.
Yeah. So there's chapter 7.
There it is.
We are going to pause or cut this off now so you can just listen to chapter 7.
But Lord willing, we'll be back soon.
And be looking for 8 and 9 and probably 15, 20 minutes as we work out how it goes. So anyway, we love you. We appreciate you, and God bless.
Bye.